We're running a little behind. We might catch up later on in the afternoon and cut a break short. But thanks so much for coming back. I want to introduce Maura O'Neill from Frameworks Institute. And as I was thinking about how I would introduce her, given that we're running short on time, I'm going to let her do the meat of it. But the one piece I felt like all morning, I was like, okay, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Well, what can I do? What should I do? And when we're talking about prevention of child abuse and neglect and broader issues, social issues, there is no better organization, in my in my humble opinion, that I look to. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. Well, I want to start by thanking the Colorado Department of Human Services for giving me the opportunity to be here. And I want to start by thanking all of you in the room. And I'm thanking you because my most favorite human being on earth was born in this great state, my husband. He's a very happy Broncos fan this morning. Yes, and he's indoctrinated my children, but that's okay. My husband is the kindest, smartest, most wonderful partner, most wonderful father, one you could ever imagine. And of course, I have wonderful parents-in-law. But the story of my husband has so much bigger than that. It's about this state. It's about my mother-in-law coming here in the early 1970s and wanting to breastfeed her children and having community-based support in 1973. That's pretty amazing if you know about the history of breastfeeding in this country and sort of what was going on. It is about the public library system here, where my husband had all kinds of opportunities for enrichment programs. It is about the world-class education he received in the public school system here. And now he's a professor at one of the top departments of sociology in the country. And so I want to thank you because you all work every day and night to make sure that every child in this state can have those kinds of opportunities. And that every person who engages in a long-term partnership with a native born can get all mushy about their partners in front of a group of strangers. So I want to thank you for all the work that you do, first and foremost. So who am I and who is the Frameworks Institute? Now that you know all about my husband. We do original research on all kinds of social issues around communications, and we do this research to increase the communications capacity of nonprofits around the country. So we're probably best known for our partnership with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. So if you've heard terms like the architecture of the developing brain, the term toxic stress, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on today, or if you've heard the idea that we can pay now to provide those supports for early childhood or pay more later in the terms of more expensive social supports that are needed, those all sort of emerged from our partnership with Harvard. So we started studying how the public thinks about early childhood development, the biology of early adversity in the United States, but we're now doing a lot of work internationally. So we're working in Canada with the Alberta Family Wellness Institute. We're doing a lot of work in the United Kingdom around the social determinants of neglect, and I'll share some of that research with you later on today. We're in Brazil, Australia, Kenya, South Africa, to think about how people think about early childhood development all around the world. We don't just do early childhood. We're on a big project now with the National Human Services Assembly, who are trying to change the narrative around human services from one of charity to an idea of the human services as an essential part of our society who has a workforce that needs to be recognized and resourced. We work on immigration reform, criminal justice reform. So we like to say that we wake up each morning thinking about all kinds of dire social issues, which sounds like an awful job, but it's a wonderful job because, again, I get to be working with groups like you all. We're mostly PhD level researchers. So you'll see at the top of the screen, we have a lot of people who study language and linguistics. They can tell you all kinds of interesting things about alliteration and assonance. They can tell you things like people are likely to believe something that rhymes than something that doesn't. So if I tell you right now, woes to my foes, you're likely to more agree with that than if I said harm to my enemies. I'm trained in sociology, so language just doesn't happen in a sort of a vacuum, but it's shaped by powerful institutions in terms like political structures, media gatekeeping, and we also know a lot in sociology about how framing, about how language has been absolutely essential to some of the most successful social movements that we've seen in the last century, like the civil rights movement. We have more anthropologists than you can shake a stick at, but do not shake sticks at anthropologists because they'll think you're performing some bizarre ritual. Things in the office can get really weird really fast. But we keep them around because when we're talking about storytelling for social change, you need to know something about culture. You need to know something about the way people think. And so they're the sort of experts at doing that work. And finally, so that we aren't just pointy-headed academics doing research, we have people who have been veterans of advocacy campaigns, and also a wonderful digital media team that makes sure that our research recommendations are in a form, again, that is visually usable for people on the ground who have to do this work. So I'm going to talk to you about the research that we've done in the United States on early childhood and early adversity. We've been doing this work for over 15 years, just about 15 years. It's a large body of research. I'm going to show you some of the methods, but I'm not going to get into the weeds. So if there's any methods geeks out there, anybody? I'm happy to answer questions, but I'll just give you a brief overview. So I want to start by talking about what we mean at frameworks when we talk about a frame. So when you are speaking, every decision that you make, everything you emphasize, everything that you don't emphasize, every word you use has impacts on how a person is going to hear that information, the types of opinions that they're going to have about that information, the kinds of attitudes that they're going to have about that information. And so framing in terms of the academic discipline was such a huge shift because it really looks at public understanding, how we know things, not as set in stone, not as sort of always there, but shaped by the context in which people are hearing things, how things are said, what things are said. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. The framing, the understanding is frame dependent. So there's a classic study out of University of Michigan. They asked respondents, given the importance of free speech, would you support a hate rally in your neighborhood or in your community? 85% in favor. Now, slight shift in the question. Given the risk of violence, do you support that same event? Okay? 40% in favor. Now, are there any statisticians in the room? This difference is like Santa came early. This is a huge difference in people's perception, and it's just the difference of a couple of words, right? So how you ask a question, how you communicate something can really make a difference. And we see this over and over again in our own work. So what I want to share with you right now is what we call on-the-street interviews. So you've all been approached by someone who's soliciting you on the street. Sometimes that would be me. And so I say, hey, please, person, stop. Come and talk to me. I'll give you a $10 Starbucks card. And you say yes, because you're a very kind person. And I say, I want to talk to you about early childhood. And I ask really basic questions. How do kids develop? What might go wrong? What might the impacts of stress be? And I get your answers. And then I say to you, I want to share with you an idea that some scientists are using to talk about stress, toxic stress, and I want you to know what you think. And I read you this statement. I read you the metaphor of toxic stress. So you don't even have it in your hand. And then I ask you the same set of questions to see the differences in your answer. So I want to show you the before clip. This is some of the research we've done in the United Kingdom.
It's a normal part of development, in my opinion.
You can't hear that very well, but she says it's a normal, in a lovely British accent that I will not try to replicate. She says it's a normal part of development, in my opinion. So what is stress? It's a normal part of development, in my opinion. So now she hears toxic stress, the taxonomy of toxic stress, and we're going to talk about this.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. a lot of the emotional developments and the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
So a profoundly different answer. And again, this is a 2-minute, I read you a metaphor where she can start to think about how severe early adversity can have impacts on the developing brain and really shape the trajectory of someone's developmental outcomes. Seconds only that she's getting this information. And a very different conversation about the role of stress. So at Frameworks, the reason why we're such research geeks is because the impacts of your messages is knowable. You don't have to rely on guesswork. There's been methods that have been developed to figure this out. So what I want to show you is one of our online experimental surveys. So in this part of our research, I'm going to give you the value of interdependence. And what I'm going to show you are things about people support in Alberta about addiction policies. So your interdependence. You get ingenuity. We can, we're a smart people. We can solve difficult problems. You get empathy. So we're going to feel, addiction is a serious problem. The people who are suffering from addiction, we need to reduce the stigma. And you get nothing. But you're really, really important in this survey because you're the control group. So we're measuring everybody's response based on your response. You're the baseline. So this is what we found. Interdependence and ingenuity are raising people's supports for policies that would improve systems of care for people suffering from addiction. And empathy, the value that advocates were using was actually depressing support for the very policies that they wanted to advance. And the reason that we saw this was happening is that people think about addiction in highly individualistic terms. It's about your willpower, it's about your ability to overcome. And so by invoking empathy, people got so down the rabbit hole of an individual story that they couldn't see why those social supports for people with addiction were necessary. So if addiction is all about my personal, I got to pull myself up, I got to reach rock bottom. Again, we can think about all the ways we talk about addiction in this society, and it's true in Canada as well, that by saying you need to feel sorry for people suffering from addiction, it actually hardened their willingness to support those very things that would help people suffering from addiction. So you can know these effects. Now, I've been talking about what we test frames against. And what we're looking for is we're looking for those language cues that are going to help people think about problems as social problems. So do we have any sociology majors in the room? No, just a few statisticians. This is a great crowd. So this is C. Wright Mills, and he talked about the difference between telling stories that are about issues, that are about the private troubles of an individual person, to telling stories, about troubles, to issues, social stories that have social problems and are in need of systemic and policy level changes. So this is where we live in frameworks. There's important goals of all kinds of communications campaigns. So some communications campaigns are really designed to address individual behavior change. You got to eat this, you got to exercise. There are communications campaigns that are about raising awareness or salience of an issue. So the ribbons are always sort of a good example of that. Well, we really live on the side of communications that is trying to figure out ways that you can get the public, cultivate public will around big level systemic policy change. And I'll talk about this some more. So this is just an example of that kind of frame shift. So tobacco, the shift in how we think about tobacco is sort of a paradigmatic example of moving tobacco from a frame that is about individual vice, about addiction being, again, something that I'm at fault for, that I need to do something about, to the frame of a defective product. So when you make that switch, the solutions become less about changing behavior and more about changing the policies that surround us and that shape our decision-making context. So in the context of early childhood development, that's what we're trying to do. It's not that we don't think that individual behavior change is important in these issues, but we're trying to build public understanding and public will about changing the context in which caregivers are making decisions, right? So that's where we are. But where we start, so that's the end, that's where we want to get to. Where we start is we need to know where the public is. You as communicators who want to talk about child abuse and neglect, what does the public already know about these issues? And I want to run you through a brief experiment to show you why this is so important. So this is 90 seconds, there's no sound, and I just want you to sit back and watch and notice your reactions. Okay, show of hands. How many people made up a story about what was going on? Okay, almost anybody. Anybody want to share their story? Yeah. Yes, yeah, tell it. So a bullying story. Anybody else have a different kind of story? Yeah. Right. Any other kind of story? Yeah. So you all are very much like every person who was run through this story, in that I think it was 96% of the people also came up with stories. So there's stories of star-crossed lovers, stories of sort of the Hansel and Gretel story people sort of put on there. When I work, I work with all different kinds of advocates. I'm always so impressed with how people dedicated. So many talked about children's issues here. When I show this to people who are working around immigration reform, they start to talk about the border, criminal justice. You can imagine is a different kind of story. But the point of doing this is that, think about it, you all created a story, and those are just triangles and circles spinning around in space. Now, yes, that one part looked like a door, but your stories went so much beyond just the simple telling of information. We have motivation, we have all kinds of ascriptions of emotions to that story. So where we start with frameworks is that there is a story there about your issue, whether you are telling it or not. And so knowing what that story is, knowing where the public is on issues of child abuse and neglect is the first step. So I want to show you some of the research that we found. So you all advocates, you might be out in the world and say something like, it's important to limit the exposure to adversity that children experience in the earliest years. And maybe you go on and you talk about child abuse and neglect. And this is what you might hear back.
Life's hard. It's supposed to be hard. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You know, all the bad cliches you can think of. I mean, there's been people that have come from absolutely nothing to make it in whatever society's eyes deems success.
I haven't had that good of a past, like mine is what you're kind of talking about, but I think I've conquered it, overcame it. There's nothing you can do to prevent that from happening. It's going to happen regardless. Like, all you can do is just, I don't know. I don't think there's nothing you can do.
So you see in that interaction, the advocate is trying to talk about what is happening developmentally to children when they experience chronic stressors, and what might you hear back. So the first man, you couldn't hear it so well, and this is common when you're talking to the American public and other parts of the world. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I don't know how many times I've been on the street talking to people where they've told me absolutely horrific stories of abuse, and the story is all about you have to overcome. And again, there's no consideration of what is happening. I'm not saying that people don't overcome, but the story is much more complex, and that's what the advocate was trying to say. And the second woman's like, there's nothing you can do. These are just problems that are with us. And so it's not that you have the luxury of just communicating into an empty fishbowl where you can sort of put your communications in and they're going to swim around. People bring these understandings with them when they are hearing you talk, watching your PowerPoints, when you're at the Thanksgiving dinner table talking about what you do. People have very patterns ways of understanding early adversity. So instead of that fishbowl, the metaphor that we like to use at Frameworks is one of a swamp, an incredibly complex ecosystem that has lots of beautiful things in there, lots of orchids, but nonetheless a dangerous ones. There are alligators there waiting to eat what you say and to change it in ways that is actually opposite to the intended meaning of your message. So let's take a deeper look into the swamp of early childhood adversity.
Why is it that some kids turn out okay, you think, and others don't? You think?
Because,
Well,
That's a pretty deep question. That's a great question.
the difference between a child who turns out well and a child who doesn't turn out well is what?
I think a lot of it has to do with the parents.
I think it has a lot to do with the family.
the majority of it comes from their parents.
Parents, all falls back on their parents.
I think it goes back again to family.
Sometimes there's no father.
They do come from parents.
I feel like it has to reflect on the parents.
How do the genetics and the environment, you made this sort of gesture with your hands. Like can you put that into words?
Not really.
Biology,
Part of it's in the gene.
Whole nature versus nurture.
cellular karma, what genes they inherit.
I think to a point, if you have screwed up parents, you're going to have screwed up kids.
Just their biology just makes them who they are.
Sometimes I actually think it's just meant to be.
So how would you explain, a situation where someone, has parents who are neglectful and yet they turn out okay?
I guess it just, I guess it just depends on your own personality and whether or not you're born with like a sort of optimism or pessimism, that sort of thing.
It's kind of, I think it's all a part of the, attitudes and temperaments.
The failures are those that choose to fail.
They have a positive attitude on life and they're trying to go up.
If you have created the mentality of a strong child, the child is not going to let anything that's bordering it stop it from progressing.
It takes a personal determination.
You know right from wrong. It's a choice they make, I think.
Willpower seems to have a lot to do with it.
I think you got to believe in yourself.
If you're strong, if your matrix is strong, not in the movie sense.
Those who choose to fail. You could choose to fail.
I just think it's all choices. I mean, really and truly, I just think it's a choice.
Okay, so let's map that swamp. What does it look like, and why is it important for you all to know? So the first thing you hear over and over again, it's this idea of willpower, that no matter what has happened to you, you are responsible, even if you are a young person, of overcoming that, of having a different kind of attitude, of having a better mentality. And this isn't that this isn't true, but when we start thinking about all of the social supports that we want to put in place to both prevent child abuse and neglect, to have those things in place when it is happening, to sort of offload some of those risk factors, load up the protective factors, it becomes very difficult to think when all you can think about is how that individual child should take responsibility for their own outcomes. when people aren't thinking about responsibility of children themselves for overcoming, parents are the primary actors that they go to. Again, this is not to say that what parents do are not important. But again, if we call it at Frameworks the family bubble, if all they can think about, if the only context of importance is the family, then again, all of the other things that both shape one's ability to parent and that actually contribute to that child's developmental outcomes becomes extremely difficult to think. The other thing for you all to know is that there is a great deal of fatalism about children who have experienced adversity. So, on the one hand, this is an important thing about cultural models. They're not internally consistent. On the one hand, you're responsible for everything and you must pull yourself up. On the other, damage done is damage done. There's nothing we can do about that if a sort of negative trajectory starts to happen. When you use the word resilience, it is often thought of as, again, inner grit, motivation, capacity to act. Again, it doesn't have those sort of contextual meanings that the scientists who study resilience want to talk about. There is an orchid in this swamp. So everything I'm saying, all these are alligators that are just waiting to sort of eat your messages about the kinds of supports we need to put in place to prevent child abuse and neglect. But people can see, again, if pushed, they can see a role for context. They just don't have a lot of practice doing that because think about sort of our sort of cultural scripts around these issues. It is about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Now, knowing this swamp is not just a descriptive exercise. It actually can be incredibly helpful as you plan your communications because you know there's alligators and you know those are those things that can help you. So you can pick communication cues that can sort of bring forth that more contextual element and avoid those that are going to sort of have your message dead in the water every time. So, for example, if you know that there's a lot of fatalism around child abuse and neglect, not only that it's going to happen and it's a problem that's too big to solve, but that once a child has experienced those things, that they're sort of on this negative path, you can think about where you might want to put your data about the prevalence of child abuse and neglect. So I'm sure nobody in this audience is doing that, but one of the things that I see often when we're reviewing communications is that the communications start with X number of kids are being neglected and abused every year. Now, if you think about that from the perspective of the swamp, you are inadvertently activating that sense that this is an intractable problem by leading with that. So you can use the swamp to sort of think about your language cues and think about those things that might get activated. So I want to talk about some communications traps that we see and sort of ways around that that we've empirically tested. So the first thing is that people think. You might hear something like child abuse and neglect isn't a big problem. No, it is a big problem. These are the stats. So I want to show you a study from the University of Michigan. So this is what they tested those sort of myth fact sheets. And what they found was they gave participants these myth fact sheets and they asked them questions like, is the flu a serious disease? No, it's not. So what they found was first that people misremembered the myths as true. Now, this makes sense, right? If you're thinking about this as how communications activate the swamp, if you are reminding people of things that they already believe to be true, even if you're discounting that, you're nevertheless activating that. The effect got worse over time. So they invited people back 2 weeks later and asked them, is the flu a serious disease? And they misremembered some more. And then the kicker of this whole study is that they attributed the false information to the CDC. So they left the study with, the CDC says the flu isn't a serious disease. So just one framing oath, I would just want you to raise your hands. If you don't say anything again, I don't agree with anything again, please do not put out myth fact sheets. They don't work. Research has shown them time and time again. Again, if you think about this from the swamp. So it's not simply about correcting their mistakes, but it's about telling a new story. So one of the things that we recommend is that you use values, things that help people understand that this is a collective problem. It is something that impacts us all. It is not about those poor children over there, but it is about Colorado and our future. And when we act, it's not just helping those people over there, but we are stronger as a society. So that you are reminding people time and time again of both their collective responsibility for this issue, that it's not just those bad parents, that we all need to do something, and everything that can come when we provide those supports for family and children. So values are a good way to do that. And the one that we've tested that shows that, that increases people's supports for the kinds of programs that you all are working on and you're advocating for is that of prosperity. And it's not just sort of economic prosperity. It's not just, you know, let's do this so kids can make money. It's about our social prosperity, our economic prosperity, our cultural prosperity, that we are stronger, our workforce is stronger, our democracy is stronger when all children have the supports that they need. What it helps do is it helps people get away from the family bubble by not invoking individual responsibility and reminding them that they do believe we are responsible for children. You're getting around that tendency to just think about parents as the only location where we need to get something done. You are sort of, again, by invoking this idea of collective prosperity, that it's not just we need to do well for children so they can go out and make money, but it's about all of us. And it's a much more effective value than crisis. So I want to talk a bit about crisis messaging. So another trap that we see, again, not with you all, but we've seen with people who are communicating about child abuse and neglect, is the tendency to talk about how big the problem is without explaining why the problem is happening or what the consequences are. So this is a study done out of Dartmouth, and it was two researchers who wanted to test communications around decreasing people's belief that vaccines cause adverse reactions and increasing their willingness to vaccinate their children, especially if they were unwilling. So I just want to talk about two conditions. The first was just this picture you see here of the child who had contracted measles, and then a story, a narrative about a child who had contracted measles. And so what they found is that among those, that this actually increased people's belief that vaccines cause sort of adverse reactions, and it decreased people's willingness to vaccinate their children if they were so predisposed. And the reason that is that when you are communicating around fear-based or crisis messages, you just don't know where it's going to go. It is such a volatile emotion that it actually can have sort of negative impacts on your communications goals. So instead of crisis messaging, what we talk about at Frameworks is the need for explanation. And one of the things, communications tools that we recommend are metaphors. We love metaphors so much at Frameworks because you think about them as beautiful literary devices, but they're along with that, they're actually powerful devices for thinking. They allow us to take something that is very, very familiar and map it onto something that is unfamiliar. They're sticky. They're passable, they're communicable. And so the one metaphor that we've been developed, again, with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child is that of toxic stress. What toxic stress does for people who are communicating about child abuse and neglect is it helps people see that this is not when it is chronic, when there are no adults buffering those situations, when it is relentless, that those can actually have biological impacts on the child that can not, it's not deterministic, have lifelong developmental impacts. So what this is designed to do, this metaphor is designed to do, is to get around the idea that early adversity is just something you got to take your knocks and get over. It's really important A lot of times sort of toxic stress is probably one of our best known metaphors. And it's important that communicators use them when they can in a taxonomy, because not all stress is bad, right? That's not what the scientists are telling us. There is positive stress, preparing for a test, preparing for a big talk that gets you sort of motivated to do something. There's stress that is bad, but again, when there are supportive adults buffering those experiences, they're not going to have the same developmental impacts. And then there's toxic stress. So really getting people to understand what the potential impacts of severe abuse can be is important. So I want to show you again one of these on the street interviews, a sort of before after of people being able to think about early adversity on developmental outcomes.
So if you were to try to kind of describe what development is, what would you say?
The growth.
Growth. Elaborate. Like, what do you mean by growth? Like, just getting bigger?
Well, changing. As a child develops, the more sustained negative influences that they have, whether it be violence, poverty, whatnot, the more damage it's going to do to their long-term growth.
So I think children learn by response. So if they're neglected for maybe a day, that won't affect their whole entire life. If they're neglected for the first few years of life, it will affect them.
Their entire mental development is not going to go through the way it should. It's not going to completely develop because they're not given the outlets needed to do so. They're not given the right properties. They don't have the foundation to go off of that.
It makes sense, right? Like toxic does make sense to people, and I think if there's some definition or some clarity around it, I think it really could work in linking into how this toxicity or these pieces really impact development. And how stress, linked in with stress, because stress has huge impacts as well, right? So linking it in, everybody knows what stress is, but maybe not how it affects children. So linking the two together, I think it would work.
So again, very different discussions about what might be the effects of early adversity. And toxic stress, again, it's starting to get into the public discourse. It's starting to get into our public conversations about early adversity. So this is a position paper put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics. It is an incredible thing because it's a public health paper. It's really designed to talk about those conditions which make children more susceptible to adverse experiences. Usually, pediatricians are working in the medical model, sort of target that one child and sort of what we can do. But really thinking about the social determinants of toxic health is just an incredible thing to see out of the AAP. So now I want to show you. So what I'm talking about here is metaphors that help people think about the effects of child abuse and neglect. So now I'm going to show you some metaphors that we've developed in the UK that are really designed to talk about the social determinants of neglect specifically. And what it is called, and we're in the process of testing this in the United States, it's called the overloaded lorry. So you'll see right now we're going to have to do something to shift it for the US. So the idea is just like a lorry can only bear so much weight before it stops moving forward, when an especially large burden is loaded on a person who's already overloaded, it can cause a breakdown in care. Over time, this heavy load puts a strain on people and can lead to things like mental health issues and substance abuse, problems that further weaken people's ability to care for children. Just like we can unload an overload lorry, social supports can offload sources of stress from overloaded parents and improve their capacity to care for their children. These supports help keep families and communities moving forward. So what I'm going to show to you now is a thing we called persistence trials. And this is one of the ways that we test metaphors. It's my favorite thing to do. So I'm a researcher. I come into the room and I have you two with me. And I say, okay, I'm going to give you this metaphor. Read it. And we talk it over and you ask me questions. And I say, okay, give me that sheet of paper. You now are in charge to present it to these two people. And you pass it on to them. Again, this is all oral this is all done orally, not without any paper. And I say, you can make your presentation any way you want. And you teach it to them, and then you leave the room, and I give it to you guys, and I say, okay, now it's your turn. I want you to teach it to those two. So what we're looking for is how the metaphor passes. The power of metaphor is that it's sticky, it's communicable. So that if I can talk about an overloaded lorry and talk about it with someone in my community, they can start using it to talk about the social determinants of neglect. And that's what we're looking for. So these are results of overloaded lorry in the UK.
The driver of the big lorry is basically the carer or whoever's in charge of the family and the child.
The parent is, or the family is this truck.
Imagine the luggage being different reasons why the family might have stresses.
Money in the family, it could be the experiences of that parent or parents growing up. They might have come from sort of a challenging background. It could be sort of, they have problems with drugs, alcohol. It could just be that everything's just too much for them, and psychologically or emotionally they can't manage.
What eventually happens is that the car's axles just collapse under the weight of all the stresses that are being brought onto the car.
Things get dropped off, picked up along the day, along the way, and sometimes if things don't go to plan, the truck can get overloaded.
There's so much layers and problems loading up on individuals' shoulders, and it inevitably they're going to break, they're going to crack.
But eventually, more work burdens come up, more poverty issue burdens come up, lack of money issue, higher rents going up, family difficulties, all sorts of problems, adding and adding to burdens to the extent that they're coming into the cab, they're crowding in. So you can't even touch the brake. You can't see through the windscreen. You don't know where you're going.
It's been overloaded with all of this stress or rubbish. It eventually starts spilling out into the street, which would be like society. So as a young person becomes older, that could sort of having a negative impact on society, crime or behaviour in school or behaviour towards others.
And it fills the back of the truck almost to breaking point. But in an ideal world, you get to drop those burdens off at different depots.
The idea is that you need this support network. You might need a navigator or the delivery people, the collections, to help you.
Every suitcase is different, so I don't think one AA man can fix the whole lot. I think you need specialists in different teamwork.
It can be overwhelming to try and do everything at the same time, but if you have support, outside support that comes in and compartmentalises things while seeing the bigger picture, then you can start to kind of break that down.
And the help, again, can come from lots of different places, not just social services, and not even just the traditional routes of the church, the social services, the school.
Making more activities, more groups for mothers, fathers and their children to do together. So everyone's actually moving in the same direction. So it's not just the parents driving the truck, it's they're all doing it actually together.
It's about taking something off of their load, relieving it off their shoulders, to helping them move forward and becoming better involved with their kids.
I can watch the Brits play with metaphors all day. Sorry that this is a little bit hard to see. But the thing here is the pre-discussions that we sort of evil parents who are doing these awful things to their children. And instead, you get quite a different discussion about, again, the causes of neglect, the social causes of neglect. And you notice there's a lot of invocation of the pronoun we. Right? What can we do? Not just what they do. It's not a problem from over there. And what are those things? How can we sort of shift the load for parents and sort of increase their capacity to care? So it's a very different discussion. And again, you'll notice that guy in the end he's just like straight out of a British rom-com. I just love that. And he's, moving around. The guy at the end talking about all the social services that need to be involved in this problem. So we are testing this in the context of elder abuse in the United States, and we're hoping to test it in early childhood. But this idea of being overloaded seems to be showing a lot of promise. Again, it won't be Lori. And just a note, when we're coding these, when we're looking at these videos, when we see the people gesturing, and when we see if they're able to sort of generate new things from the metaphor, for us, that's a sign of a powerful metaphor, because people are experiencing it as embodied knowledge. So our final trap that I want to talk about is, again, the invocation of crisis without solutions. So what I'm showing you here is a Facebook meme that Jamie Oliver put out that was designed to sort of raise public awareness of sort of sugar being added to our food supply. So it wasn't about people changing their diets, but it was really meant to talk about sort of how we're getting sugar into foods in ways that we're sometimes not aware of. So it's data. 26,000 primary age kids were admitted to hospital last year because of tooth decay caused by sugar. Hashtag sugar rush. So how was that? So this is a huge problem, like 26,000 kids. We're in a state of crisis. How was that interpreted? So here are the tweets some of the tweets that came from that. So educate, educate, educate. Cook homemade food. Drink water. Take responsibility for your children. It's impossible to omit sugar from kids' diets. We can help them with toothbrushing and like sort of a sarcastic good luck. So again, it was designed to bring attention to a systemic problem, and without that, the sort of solutions, what we can do, and without the explanation, people immediately go to individuals and the decisions that they're making around their diets, or to a sense of, I'm throwing my hands up, there's nothing I want to do. Now again, that wasn't the intent of this communications. It was about bringing awareness to the food industry. So I want to show you sort of what this looks like. Again, this is research that we've done in the UK on the social determinants of neglect. So it's the same research design that I showed you. And you now get a story about social responsibility. So we're all responsible for this problem. You're going to get social responsibility plus facts about the prevalence of neglect. And then you're going to get a full story. That's social responsibility, facts about prevalence of neglect, and a specific solution. What should be done to address this? So we have the value. It's doing really well across all the batteries. So we're talking about people having a sense of efficacy, that we can do something, that we should support solutions, that they understand the scope of the problem, that they feel a sense of collective responsibility for the solutions, and that they would do something to address neglect. So values are doing something good. It's making people think this is a problem for all of us. Values plus facts about prevalence actually decreases support, and you lose your statistical significance. So that message is as good as saying nothing in terms of raising people's supports for the kinds of policies. And the hypothesis here is that people, they understand they're responsible, but the problem is so big with the prevalence facts, and they have nowhere to go with it, that again, you get that fatalism again. But when you tell a complete story that has concrete solutions for people to be able to engage in, get involved with something, support this, support that, whatever the things that you are trying to advocate for, again, you get back your support for those policies plus more. So again, we often find this, that sometimes people are so sort of wrapped up in describing the problem that they forget to put solutions, or they put the solutions on page 49 of the annual report. And what we say at Frameworks is you really want to think about flipping that order, that you highlight those solutions. Now, I'm not saying that we all live in a land of unicorns and fairy tales and everything is wonderful and we can do everything, but it's a magic combination of explaining the problem and having the solutions match the scope of the problem so that it doesn't become a problem that is too big to address. So again, when we're working, that sort of big shift that we at Frameworks, and again, the scientists we work with at the Harvard Center, that we're trying to move, again, if you think about that tobacco from a vice to a defective product, to move that it's just about the kids, that it's for all of us. We are all impacted if this problem goes on, and when we effectively do something, we all benefit. Abuse and neglect isn't an inevitable problem. There are things you all know what can be done. You are working to try to prevent those, and people need to be aware of that work. Data cannot speak for themselves. Again, just remember the circle, triangle, square, that experiment that I put in front of you. You all interpreted an incredible amount of meaning into that simple experiment. People do the same with data. You cannot leave naked numbers. Data has to be framed because you will be just amazed at what people do when they just see data points. It has to be embedded in story. This is not a problem for them over there, this group of people. It is all of us. We know that there are groups of people who are more at risk, but we all are impacted. That it's not about, again, that vulnerable child, but there are sensitive periods of development, and we know those things we can do to make sure that we have optimal outcomes. And again, flipping the salience of problem and solution, really giving people a sense of their efficacy, that we know what works, and we're working hard to put those things in place. And the final thing that I want to say is that we do know, again, from the social movements literature, that when groups can come around, when they can change the public discourse about an issue, when they can start to tell a new story, when lots of people in lots of different places are telling that story, that you can see incredible changes in how we address social issues. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions, comments.
Are we going to be able to have access to your slideshow today?
Yes, you'll get all the slides. And I also, there's the, my, what's that called, website address. And we have all of our research available on all of our topics online. We not only research reports, but things we call toolkits that have sample communications. You do not have to cite us. You can just take language and plagiarize it, for lack of a better word. So all of these resources are available, and we encourage people to do that because, again, if you think about this core story approach, if you as a field start to tell the same story, not say the same thing, but tell the same story, explain development, explain what can derail development in the form of child abuse and neglect, you know, a bigger chorus tells a lot louder song. So all of those resources are available to you online.
And I failed to share earlier this morning. Everything that we've shared out today will be emailed to you tomorrow. You'll get a survey this afternoon asking you how you liked it. But I will share those resources out for you tomorrow. And then where was that question? Okay.
We're based in DC. And I'm specifically based in Madison, Wisconsin, but I'm the only remote one. But yeah, we're DC based. I should have said that at the top. And I will say that we, when I'm showing you the research, we do nationally representative samples on all kinds of demographics. So people in Colorado were sampled, and we're looking at sort of where the population of the country lives in. So you can feel confident that the recommendations are actionable here. Your swamp looks, there's differences, but there's a lot of similarities in your swamp to, say, California.
So I love what you said about data and how it needs to be embedded in a story, because data is certainly not my favorite part of my job. It's the thing I'm probably worst at, and I understand that it's important and why. But when I'm talking about numbers, especially in a smaller county, I get a question at every single orientation from prospective foster families about how many kids are in foster care in Boulder County. And then always that's followed up with another question about, and how many families do you need? It's like we have warehouses of children that are waiting to be placed in foster care, and we're just going to keep them in their homes until we have families. So it's just clear that there's this disconnect amongst people who are considering doing foster care. How do I talk about numbers in terms of, what do I say to the question about how many families do we need versus how many kids do we have in care? Because I just talk about, we're not talking about the families that we need for the kids who are in foster care today. We're talking about the kids that are going to come into foster care tonight and tomorrow night and next week. How do I reframe that so that people see the importance of not the number that we're at right now, but why we need families today for the kids of tomorrow?
I mean, I would do something like you just did for me. So I would say, I would probably start with, we have this system in place. and it's for the benefit of us all. I'm not going to do a beautiful job here. I would explain the problem, right? So we have X many kids in, and so many kids are coming in, and I would just take the time to map out all of the steps that you just said to me, and not rely on just those numbers. Tell a story about it and explain the system. How does it work? Where are the kids? How do we have a sense of, and this is I don't know, how do we have a sense of, how do we prepare for what's coming? What sort of systems are in place for you to do that work? Why, I mean, to just take the time to give people the cognitive tools that they need to be able to grasp the extent of the program, extent of the problem. So again, I'd have to sort of look more specifically at what you were doing, but what you just did right there, standing up, was a very good start.
Hi, I just want to ask you, do you deal with ACE research study, adverse childhood?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So we've been, Robert, I'm going to forget his last name.
Vincent Valetti.
Paletti, thank you, are some of the scientists that we work with. So when we are not the scientists of early adversity, we're the communication scientists, but we develop what we call the core story in conjunction with mostly the scientists at the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, but Vincent Paletti has a relationship with them. So one of the first steps that we do when we're taking on a research project is we interview those scientists and we say, what is it that you think the public needs to know about ACEs or about sort of stress and sort of the biological impacts of adversity? So we don't sort of make the science. We say, okay, scientists, you tell us what you want to say, and we do the work of finding the research to translate that science for non-experts.
Well, one thing I noticed that you said is I have a huge group that I work with nationwide and internationally, but what it is the ACE research study, we use that. And one thing I know that we're probably doing wrong is the first thing we say is this is a crisis situation and it's insurmountable, it's epidemic. And I think that's probably been hurting our cause. But what's happening is there's thousands and thousands of cases throughout the nation and internationally where kids are not protected in the system by the courts, even though there's abuse there, sexual abuse allegations, and we can't protect them.
Right, I mean, by me saying don't use crisis language, it's not saying that we are not in a crisis. So the social analysis is different than the communications analysis. We are in a crisis. I'm not saying that. But if you want to build, if your communications goals are to build public support for the kinds of systems that we need in place to do something about that crisis, you can't use crisis language because, again, you don't know, people throw their hands up. This is too big. This is just, it's what's going to happen. That fatalism is so strong. And you're competing with every other crisis that people wanted, the obesity crisis, the addiction crisis, and so there's a fatigue there. So again, it's just not to say that we're not in crisis. It's what you want to do is inspire a sense of efficacy among the people that you're communicating with.
And if you have a question, and I'm over here, go ahead and put your hand up so I know what direction to go to, and I'll get to you eventually. Okie doke.
Great job on everything that you said. I really like presentations that make you think about how to frame things and like the tipping point and all of these really great concepts that help with everything like that. Have you guys done any research on like humor messaging as opposed to all of these sad stories that we put out all the time versus comics or kind of lightening the mood? Does that resonate better with people?
Well, so I would be hard pressed to think about a sort of a comedic story about child abuse and neglect. So obviously some issues don't lend themselves. However, we have worked with the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative to make a sort of comedy about addiction issues. I guess comedy might not be the right word. So usually what we do is we do the research to figure out the concepts that are working to translate that science, and then we work with brilliant people who actually implement that, like the people at Ground Floor Media, to actually put that into campaigns. So come and see me, I can show you the Alberta Family Wellness their take on addiction and comedy. I haven't seen it done on child abuse and neglect, but again, it's not communicating the levity of the situation. But again, I can't go say this enough. But this is an actionable problem is of utmost importance.
I was actually just talking with Julie here yesterday, talking about how we need to like front load mental health services, you know, to prevent like, because eventually we'll pay like 4 times that, you know, in the prison population, what we put there, and how we get that message across. And, you know, when you were talking about all these things, just brought me back to the example where last year we had a speaker come, and he was talking about trauma on the brain and how it affects a child, and how it just sounded so hopeless. Like you really can't do anything about it. By the end of the training, everybody was so depressed at the end of it. But we love him because he's like such a wealth of information. But I got to talking to him, like, we gotta, like, maybe at the next training, because we've been having him for years and years come every year, but like, could you talk about what we can do about it, what our foster parents can do, because that would be so much more helpful than just knowing that everything's terrible.
Well, so I mean, I think there's two parts of that story. So I've only presented on toxic stress, but right, the scientists are also showing incredible things about neuroplasticity and about resilience, right? So that's another part of the science story, that when you can put those protective factors in place, damage done is not damage done. There's an incredible amount of change that can happen. So the science story is there, and then you all have the sort of direct intervention programmatic story, right? You all have evidence-based programs that you can, you know, I was reading a lit review last night that you can point to show impacts when we put in preventative measures. So in terms of the solutions part of the story, there's the science side of neuroplasticity, but there's also the effective programs that you all are working to put in place. And that's when, you know, people who are the experts, but the sort of non-scientist experts really have to come in to that story.
Hi, I have a question. Sorry. I'm a child abuse prevention expert. So this is a question. I work with the UK. So they are 10, 15, 20 years ahead of us. How, and when I say that, I'm referring to their swimsuit lesson. They have made that a public campaign where every child is learning that no one should touch you where a swimsuit lies. And they've done what I've been trying to do for years, take child abuse out of this scary dark closet and put it in public health. And they've been very effective at it. How do we follow them here? How do I do that here? And I know that's a huge question. It can steer me in the right direction. They've done a great job about making it acceptable to talk about. It's still not really acceptable here to talk about child abuse prevention.
Battery might have died. Try the wired one behind you.
And the public is about 15 years ahead of us as well in terms of their understanding. So I think, you know, I think our research has some ideas there, but it's an empirical question, right? That you can know how to do this well by testing messages. So our research is really designed to build public will to start put those things in place, but not those sort of, again, direct behavioral change kinds of campaigns. So I mean, I'm sorry, I can't. I don't have a better answer for you. Right.
I wondered maybe more so if you could connect me with somebody over there that I could
Sure.
who've been with for some time.
So yeah, definitely. So the Dartington Institute, Dartington Social Institute on the. I'll give you the information. But I think one of the things that you're up against is that swamp, right? The UK, and so we have to have a different conversation about child abuse, and everybody needs to start telling it, so that we can start to sort of change that discourse. So yes, but sorry.
And not to toot our own horn, but we're starting that here in Colorado. Yeah. We got $1.8 million the first year, and it's focused primarily on reporting right now because we're launching that new hotline. But we're so hoping to go down that road But we're sort of starting not how I would have started it. I would have hoped to have started on like kind of campaign you described. But we're working with, that's why I say this event is in partnership with the Office of Early Childhood. We are working with Kendra to kind of identify some of those broad-based issues. There are many, many kinds of abuse and neglect. So which do we target first? But the one thing that we know, and it's a great solution to share with the community, is you dial the number, we'll make the call. We're not going to put that on you, that you need to know everything in and out of what's going on with this kid. You have a concern, call.
And I will just say, usually when I go to different states, I have to spend 10 minutes of my talk talking about the importance of a shared communication strategy among a field of practice. And you guys are there, which is just an incredible leap forward. So, compared to other states, so I won't name other states, but you guys are 10 years ahead of other places I've been. So I've been doing quite a bit of work in Colorado, and I'm just incredibly impressed at the sophistication that people are bringing around communications.
Going back to that graph about the social responsibility and adding facts, I know we focused a lot on the social responsibility and offering solutions in that. Can you talk a little bit more about facts and whether there's a specific order to communicate those or how that works?
So the facts that we tested, again, these are all driven by the experts that we're working with. So they wanted to test how to talk about the prevalence of neglect in the UK, because people didn't really recognize how prevalent it actually was. So the one thing I will say is that we see when we do work internationally, the metaphors tend to transfer over pretty easily, values not so much. So social responsibility was something that worked in the UK, and I cannot say that it would work in the United States. So for example, the idea of prosperity we know works across early childhood issues. I went to Canada in a sort of focus group to talk about prosperity, and they almost ran me out of the room. They were like, that is disgusting. How can you put a price on a kid's head? How can you, it just, bringing up those economic issues about, we pay now or we pay more later, works like a charm with the American public, not with Canada. So I just want to make that caveat. This is UK that it's working with. So I'm not saying you go out and use social responsibility, but I think there's something to learn about the structure of a story. Values. This impacts us all. Problem. These many kids are being affected by this. Solution. And here's what we can do. So it's that structure, I think, that's so powerful. Not, here's a problem. And then maybe later on I'm going to talk about the solution. Or it's about those kids over there. So it's that full story that is so effective.
Any more questions? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Oddly enough, I don't even know that I'd shared this with you, Maura. Before we began our child abuse and neglect public awareness campaign, first focused on the hotline, we actually did some public opinion research before we'd even talked externally. And prevalence, I can't recall the numbers because I don't like to share some of our myth busters, so I haven't even memorized it, but the prevalence that people thought abuse and neglect was happening, both statewide, we asked the question in terms of like the state, and then what do you think is going on in your community? And both of those were dramatically higher than what is currently involved in the child welfare system. So that's not to say it's happening and we might not know about it. They might not be getting any help. But I just think in terms of the level that we think people know about our issues, we're good at sharing our problem. We're just not maybe there on sharing the solutions. With that, I want to just take 1 or 2 minutes. If you'd like to make a phone call, run to the restroom, because we're going to try to catch up on time, and then we're going to